Joining me is Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. And we are in the midst of a government shutdown, by no means the first one that Trump has ever presided over. But Aaron, I got to say, I was offline yesterday for Yom Kippur. In fact, I was offline since Wednesday evening when the holiday started. So I kind of feel like I need to do this show to get myself caught up on what's been going on the last couple days.
Yeah, you didn't miss a whole lot. We actually had the rumors kind of starting up again today that Trump might not be in good health or there's something going on because he has been out of the public eye since Tuesday when he was at Quantico and he and Hegseth delivered that very authoritarian and kind of chilling speech, frankly, to military leaders down there. And so we didn't see him Wednesday. We didn't see him Thursday. We're not going to see him today. And I'm sure people who have paid attention to my social channels, or we actually covered this in the newsletter as well at one point. There's some, it's kind of beyond speculation. It seems like he gets some sort of medical procedure toward the end of each month because that's when he appears on camera with that really the bad bruising and discoloration on his hand. So I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of speculating about what's going on, but it was just the end of September, and it kind of coincided with him mysteriously kind of falling out of the public eye. So, that speculation kind of started up again today. I noticed that the White House did post a proof of life video, so to speak, a very brief clip where Trump, there was a swearing in, I believe, for the ambassador to Sweden. And oftentimes these events are open to the press because, they'll do the swearing in and then Trump will proceed to make the event entirely about him and say, okay, let's take some questions. But it was not open press today. It was closed press. But one of the press aides in the White House took a very brief video and posted it. And, there was kind of like the subtext of like, he is alive. So, we know that much at least. But, this kind of it dovetails with what we are going to talk about with the shutdown because, it's not unusual for a president when a government shutdown occurs to kind of fade into the background a little bit, obviously because it's kind of a congressional issue on one level. And, especially a lot of presidents in situations like this would like to sort of project an aura of normalcy, that they're kind of, grinding to make a deal. But, Trump kind of undermines this by this week posting a variety of AI slop videos on True Social, one of which kind of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because it was frankly racist. The one with Hakeem
Oh,
Jeffries in a sombrero and a mustache. And
that was fucking disgusting.
yeah, yeah. And in that same video, it was an AI video where Chuck Schumer was saying all these profanities and, talking trash about the Democratic Party. And we see this reflected, and I know this is kind of the main topic that we're going to get to in a lot of the polling surrounding the shutdown, which shows that by pretty wide margins between like 12 to, I think the Washington Post said it as much as 17 points, percentage points higher of Americans are blaming Republicans than Democrats for the shutdown. So, it seems like in that respect, whatever the White House's strategy was, and I'm not sure there really was much of one, because that's kind of how Trump rolls, but it doesn't seem like it's really working. And it seems like, kind of this conversation that Democrats want to have about healthcare is gaining some traction. I mean, I know here in Minnesota, I think it was yesterday, some news broke about how premiums for, people who get their healthcare through the exchange here are spiking next year. And so, it's kind of organically in the news because, of course, open enrollment is next month. And so insurance companies are kind of figuring out what they're going to charge customers for their, for coverage. And then when you kind of, you have that in the news along with, Democrats, pushing this healthcare message during the shutdown, it seems like it's working based on what we're seeing in the polls right now. It's a fluid situation. As we are talking today, the Senate is taking another vote. There have been, I think, 3 Democrats who voted to reopen the government. And, there's some speculation that some of the other moderate ones maybe eventually will end up caving, but they still need, I believe, 6 total Democrats. And then Rand Paul, of course, has been voting no as well, though typically he does that and, might flip when the vote actually matters. So we'll see. But, it seems like there's no end in sight for the shutdown. It doesn't seem like it's playing super well for Republicans right now.
I think they need 7 Democrats, right? Because they need to
Yes.
get 60 and Republicans have 53. That's, of
Right.
course, if you include Rand Paul. Aaron, I want to talk about something before we get to the shutdown that you mentioned about Trump's health. Because last year, we saw with Joe Biden that as he started to have these more and more public stumbles in various ways, the media latched on like nothing else. I mean, it was absolutely wild. And I do think Democrats are fortunate in the end that they wound up replacing Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Even though Kamala Harris lost, I think that Biden would have lost by an even worse amount. But I don't think that remarkable, unprecedented move ever would have happened had the media really not sunk its talons into this story. And there's no doubt in my mind that a huge reason why they did is because Republicans had just been pushing it so relentlessly. And part of the problem why Democrats didn't want to even listen to this story was because so many of the Republican claims were such absolute nonsense BS, like this deep fake stuff that Trump has been pushing. So it became almost impossible to separate out what's real and what isn't. And it all just stands in such remarkable contrast to the fact that Trump is, you know, just about as old as Biden and having serious health issues that keep going unexplained. Obviously, in cognitive decline. I mean, I that's indisputable. Anyone who says otherwise is absurd. Even Mike Johnson, he was confronted. Was it by Pennsylvania Congresswoman Madeline Dean?
Yes.
Yeah, and she said, something to the effect of, Trump is not well. And Mike Johnson said in response to her, well, you have some people on your side who aren't well too. Like
Yeah.
he didn't even dispute her
Right.
claim. He was just trying to both sides it. So, there's nothing to really be done about this. I mean, I think Democrats will never have that go for the jugular instinct about Trump's health just because they're not as cruel as Republicans are.
Mhm.
Republicans loved to go after Biden on this because they love to hate him so much, and Democrats hate Trump plenty. But that sort of personal cruelty that animated the Biden old story is just absent now. And I think
Mhm.
without that, the media is kind of gonna let this slide, and it's disgusting and really really scary because this guy isn't well.
Yeah, and especially when you consider that the explanations the White House have offered are completely preposterous. I mean, with the bruising on Trump's hand, Carol Levitt felt compelled to address this. It was like 2 or 3 months ago in the middle of the summer, where simultaneously you had these images of Trump's hand. It's always the back of his right hand. And another thing that I've flagged on a number of occasions is, he does events now where he puts his left hand over his right hand, very intentionally to
Mm-hmm,
obscure his
hmm
hand from cameras. And then you had that, but at the same time, there was an image of Trump sitting at an event where his ankles looked really swollen, like kind of beyond, where you could maybe think, oh, are his pants fitting strangely or what's going on with the socks? No, his ankle was all swollen up. And so she addressed this at a briefing. And with the hand situation, she, literally said that it was because he was shaking too many hands and it was
Right. And,
bruising. Yeah.
and, and uh, someone on Twitter said, well, who's been shaking his ankles?
Right, right. Well, that was the ankle explanation was that like vein. I'm not going to remember the specific name of it, but some sort of vein disorder.
Mhm.
She announced that Trump had. Um, but first of all, with the handshaking thing, that's not how people shake hands. Like you shake
Right.
the
Like,
front of the hand. Like yeah, yeah. So I mean, it would be absurd even if he had bruising, on his palm. But the idea that the back of his hand was getting bruised by shaking hands. So, I mean, there's clearly a story here, right? I mean, something is going on because, you see his hand, it looks like he's kind of lacquering it up with like paint almost.
yeah,
It's
yeah, it sure
not,
does.
it does not look healthy. And, other people have noticed, I hadn't quite gotten on the rabbit hole far enough to sync it up with like the calendar, but it does seem to be something that recurs toward the end of the month typically, which kind of suggests he's getting some sort of treatment at
Mm.
that time. And so, yeah, I mean, you'd like to kind of know a little bit more about the president's health, especially given all the indications that he's not in good health, either physically or mentally. And yeah, I mean, you brought up that Mike Johnson clip, which I think was probably in some ways like the most notable clip of the week. Although maybe you could argue that some of the ones from Trump's speech to the generals, just given how authoritarian they were, might surpass that. But it's a remarkable clip because I saw there was one clip that was from like a reporter's phone camera from a distance off, and you kind of had to lip read a little bit. You could sort of faintly hear, but then MSNBC had the
Yeah.
actual like high quality video. And the thing that I was wondering as I was watching that was Mike Johnson aware that he was being
Huh.
filmed at that moment? Because there was kind of interaction with people. I've seen it like in a hallway in the Capitol. But yet this camera was pretty close. And so, Johnson is usually pretty practiced with what he says publicly. And so, it'd almost be more notable if he didn't think that he was on camera because it really kind of reflects that he's aware that there's an issue with Trump. And Dean specifically was bringing up the speech to generals and talking about how unhinged it was. And she even brought up, how our allies are, terrified by some of these things that he's saying. And, he's tarnishing the United States' international reputation. So this wasn't even really in the context of the social media posts, other indications we have that Trump is not well, either physically or mentally. But yeah, really remarkable clip because as you mentioned in your summary of it, which was accurate, he basically granted the premise that Trump
Yep.
isn't well. And so, that is very notable given how central Johnson is to kind of propping up Trump and especially in the shutdown kind of running point for Trump's agenda.
And this is not separate from what's going on with the shutdown because, yes, even if presidents during negotiations like these between the parties in Congress tend to take a backseat, first off, when does Trump ever take a backseat to anything? But Trump and the fact that his federal government have run completely roughshod over every spending agreement and every law that is in place regarding spending is critical at this point. And what this gets at is Democrats really have three potential messages to argue here in terms of the shutdown. One is that Republicans are in charge of Congress. They have majorities, they have the White House. This is on them to resolve. And of course, the obstacle here is the filibuster, because to pass anything in the Senate requires 60 votes. However, Republicans could choose to nuke the filibuster. And we've talked about that before on this show. That really hasn't come up as a topic much. But Democrats, a little bit, have been pushing this message. The message that they have been pushing the most by far is about the Obamacare subsidies that you were mentioning earlier. This crisis that is about to unfold when so many people are going to see their premiums skyrocket. And I actually think that's a feature, not a bug, from Republicans' perspective, because if people simply choose not to get insured because insurance is too expensive, then that will help undermine and ultimately destroy the exchanges potentially. If healthier people who think they can live without health insurance decide not to buy insurance, then you're left with what's known as this death spiral, where only sicker people wind up buying insurance and premiums therefore go up. And therefore, more and more people stop buying insurance, et cetera, and the premiums keep skyrocketing. But then there's this third thing, which I think we have finally seen Democrats and even Hakeem Jeffries a little bit pivot toward, which is there is no deal right now that Republicans are offering that includes any assurances or guarantees that the money that gets appropriated won't simply be impounded by Donald Trump. Impounded means that the president refuses to spend money that Congress appropriates. It's illegal, but the Supreme Court has basically allowed Trump to get away with this in many, many instances already this year. And to make any deal worth signing, Democrats need some kind of assurance that the money won't just go poof the minute the bill becomes law. And amazingly, Aaron, I don't know if you saw this, but there were a couple of Republican members of Congress. I think Steve Womack was one of them from Arkansas, who was basically like, yeah, Democrats are really up the junction here. I wouldn't sign anything if I were them because it's, would be written on water. And if Trump is totally absentee from these negotiations, then it makes it impossible for Democrats to ultimately sign or agree to any kind of bill if they can't get those assurances that they need.
Yeah, that is heartening. And I've seen a couple people, I've been watching most of what Jeffries has said publicly. And of course, because this is a fight that's really taking place in the realm now of public opinion, he's been on TV a ton, so has Mike Johnson. There's been a little inklings here and there. I think it was David Dayen who had a skit on Blue Sky today who was kind of highlighting one of the remarks that Jeffries made along the lines of what you were saying, where he's leaning into this framing now of like, we need to have some assurances that Trump and the Republicans won't just tear up the deal as soon as we agree to something. And that is heartening to me because, this has been one of those situations. And I think, the election last year led to this for me a little bit of like, trying to, humble myself a little bit in terms of not being, taking the pundit hat off more because, I think a lot of punditry too often kind of boils down to people like yourself and myself kind of projecting our own political preferences onto the electorate writ large. And like that just isn't really how politics works. Like everybody kind of approaches it differently. But one of the things that made me uncomfortable with the Democratic shutdown messaging initially was that it was kind of a message for like normal politics, in the sense of like you could
Yeah.
imagine, the George W. Bush era Republicans and Democrats fighting over healthcare policy.
Yeah.
And, within the realm of all of the lawless excesses and law breaking that Trump has done, like the fact that Republicans passed a big reconciliation bill that cuts healthcare funding, like that's legitimate. You know what I mean? Like they were elected. This was something that they said they wanted to do and they did it. And so there is kind of that sense of like, I understand that Democrats are trying to protect their constituents from harm or possibly even dying, if they lose their healthcare coverage. And that is obviously a very important thing to do. But there's also a sense in which that can kind of shield Republicans from the consequences of their own votes. And for that, kind of longer term politics of it, I just, I was just kind of squeamish about, this message about healthcare and like, just kind of, it sounds like kind of normal politics in a very abnormal time. But I'm becoming more persuaded as we get deeper into this that the message can kind of evolve along with the circumstances. So maybe this initially was about healthcare and it still is, but from there, if there are certain concessions that Republicans offer, maybe it's even like a short term restoration of the ACA subsidies. Well, then maybe the next thing is, okay, like we're open to this, but we need some assurances that you're not going to tear up the deal. And then that can open up, a space for a conversation surrounding rescissions and impoundment. And, because, frankly, if Republicans are going to just rip up deals, if Russ Voigt and Trump are going to rip up deals after they're agreed to, then like what's even the point of agreeing to any sort of spending deal of Congress really at all? So yeah, I mean, I'm heartened that, the polling seems to be on Democrats' side. The healthcare message is resonating, but then beyond that, maybe this can kind of iterate into a broader discussion about the lawlessness and the law breaking and trying to put some guardrails back on, because unless we do that, again, like a healthcare deal is not going to be worth anything. So what's even the point of agreeing to? The Democrats need some assurances that the deal will actually be followed through upon.
So, just as a reminder, if you're a paid subscriber either to Public Notice or the Down Ballot, you can ask us questions in the chat box at the bottom. We love your questions. We're happy to take them. So please fire away. Aaron, you alluded to it, but that gets us back to the polling, which I think is really, really important here. So far, there has only been one poll that I'm aware of, and I checked with a whole bunch of people because, like I said, I was offline yesterday. But I believe the Washington Post poll is the first and so far only poll about voters' attitudes about the shutdown since the shutdown began a couple of days ago. And those numbers were really stark. 47% of respondents said they assign most of the blame to Trump and congressional Republicans, and just 30% to Democrats in Congress, and 23% said they weren't sure. And given how polarized our politics are, that's pretty remarkable. That this is not just some sort of 50-50 or 40-40-20 kind of breakdown on this. And I think it was Josh Marshall I saw who posted on Blue Sky, don't voters know that they're in a bubble? He's mocking these Beltway takes, appropriately so, that a lot of DC types, reporters and pundits, think that Democrats have trapped themselves in a bubble and that they're going to be the ones who will get blamed for a
Mhm.
shutdown. And certainly all of the headlines and the lead paragraphs of these stories about shutdowns are doing their best to point a finger at Democrats. And yet, despite all of that, it's Republicans who are feeling the brunt of the blame.
Mhm.
And I think it really makes a difference to first off, how long Democrats try to fight this, how hard Democrats try to fight this, and on how many fronts they try to fight this. Because if more and more polls continue to look like the Washington Post poll, then yeah, that really does create pressure on Republicans. And Trump doesn't care about that kind of thing, but members of Congress do, because they have to get reelected somehow. And for the
Mhm.
most part, they all want to get reelected. So yeah, I'll be very interested to see where these other polls go. And to your point about, being heartened by the message, I was heartened by Jeffries expanding the message too.
Yeah.
And too often, I think Democrats in particular feel they have to have the one perfect magic bullet message. And you don't. You have to try whatever works, and also you can have multiple messages directed toward different constituencies. And so for some people, the healthcare stuff will be the right thing, and for other people, the lack of assurances from Trump and the GOP will be the right thing. And for still other people, I think this is a pretty simple one. The GOP is in charge; they have the majorities. That's going to be the right message, and I think that my guess would be that that is animating things like that Washington Post poll because people do know who's in charge.
Yeah, and the Post poll was really getting heavy coverage across a variety of networks today. I'm sure you didn't see this because this happened. I hit send on this like literally as I was logging onto this, but Roger Marshall, the senator from Kansas, was on CNN, and Brianna Keilar, the host, basically asked him, "Does this Washington Post poll kind of inform how you guys handle this from here? That you guys are losing this argument?" And he basically said, "Oh, fake poll. I discount it altogether." And then he mentioned something about like that's I've seen other polls that say something different, and Keelar was like, "Name one." And he was like, "Well, I don't have them at my fingertips." I mean, but it was like preposterous. Where any poll that Republicans don't that cuts against their narrative is just dismissed out of hand. But then if they're kind of pressed to provide some evidence to back up their position, they don't have it. But my broader point simply being that not only did like Harry Enton, who's the data guy on CNN, have a big segment on this morning, and he cited a number of other polls that weren't quite as bleak for Republicans as the Post one, but still showed that they're kind of losing this public fight. But then it kind of becomes fodder for when Republicans go on these networks where they're asked to respond to it. And then sometimes the mask kind of slips where it's like, oh, they really either don't care or it's just the same playbook we've seen over and over of like any poll that's bad is fake news. And, sometimes you get away with that when you end up winning an election, then you can say that you're vindicated and sometimes you don't. But, if they're really going to forge ahead without compromising, as Republicans are basically saying, pass this CR, we're not negotiating. Like, it seems like that's kind of a losing position. They're pretty dug in on that. Now, I still think it's going to matter how this plays out from here. And, the fact that 3 Senate Dems have already voted to reopen the government, there's indications that there might be more than that. That's a little bit concerning because I think, if it ends up being a deal where there's like a really short-term restoration of these subsidies, again, it kind of ends up being a sort of win-win for Republicans where they're shielded from the accountability of their own bad votes that they have taken, and then they're kind of bailed out which gets them out of a political jam that they're in right now. So I still think it's going to matter how things play out, not only this afternoon with this vote that's coming up in the Senate, but then next week and beyond as well. But yeah, I mean, that Post poll today surprised me with how big the split was. And, it's also heartening that people are kind of tuned in enough to hopefully have informed opinions on this because, sometimes it can feel like kind of a beltway argument that we have with ourselves. But, that gets back to, I think part of the good thing with the healthcare messaging is that for a lot of people, this is, pocketbook issue for them, or it's an issue of their own well-being and health and possibly life or death. And so, in that way, it's a lot more tangible than kind of the arguments that we sometimes have over like rule of law or democracy or authoritarianism, which, I think for a lot of people, it kind of goes, in one ear and out the other. Like when your healthcare premiums are spiking for you or your family, that's a real thing. And, it's hard to kind of spin your way out of that if you're Mike Johnson. And, it was easier maybe to do that a week ago than it is this week when people are being informed of what their premiums are going to be, or when they're shopping for care next month and they see how high the premiums are going to be, like it's going to become real tangible. And so I do think, as grim as that is for Americans, that does present some real political opportunities for Dems.
And I want to emphasize something because I feel it's incumbent on me. Last week, on a totally different topic, we were talking about the New Jersey governor's race. I emphasized the importance of not relying on just a single poll. And you alluded to this, but I want to make it clear the Washington Post poll does not stand alone. It was the first poll taken after the shutdown began, but prior to the shutdown, there was a bunch of polling, and it all showed the same thing. Again, as you say, Aaron, not quite as big a gap as the Washington Post poll, but every single poll showed voters were prepared to blame Republicans more for the shutdown than Democrats. And if you recall the 2018 shutdown, which stretched into 2019 and was the longest shutdown in American history, Republicans really started feeling pain on that one because things started getting really bad. I mean, there were serious problems with air traffic control and going to airports. That's always a major thing that rises during shutdowns. But, there were really grim and scary stories that time around of these, air traffic control workers who were just being absolutely run into the ground. People not showing up because they're furloughed and they're not getting paid. And so those who do show up are, working excessive hours. And I mean, like literally the last thing you ever want for something as serious as air traffic control. And, that the airports were only one piece of the story. So yeah, I think that there's every chance that this will follow the same pattern. And, there's something else, a more meta point here, which is when Republicans, for instance, attack Democrats on guns, let's say, it's for so many decades in the American political consciousness. This idea of Democrats are the anti gun party. It's so easy for people to believe because it's said so often. And, Democrats are the party that does push gun safety regulations, which, if you love guns, you can interpret as being anti gun. By the same token, though, Republicans are on their back foot on this one because Republicans have talked about how they hate government for more than half a century. I mean, remember Ronald Reagan's infamous line about, was it the six, eight scariest words in the English language? I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Um, and so when you have this situation, people know that Democrats are the party of government, and that can often hurt Democrats. But right now, that's helping Democrats, and people know that Republicans are the party that hates government. And so right now that's hurting Republicans because if you ask people which is the party that wants to see government functioning and properly, they're going to say Democrats. And so, yeah, I think that the longer this goes on, look, this could boomerang. This could be a high watermark for Democrats right now. Things could get worse for them. Some senators could start to peel off. But yeah, I think that Republicans are wrong-footed here.
Yeah, and it's not only just that Democrats are kind of taking up the cause of government here, but this is actually kind of one of the most popular functions of the federal government has
Yeah.
been, the ACA and making healthcare more affordable and available to people. And so, it's kind of there's certain functions of the government that maybe don't pull as well or that don't benefit people as directly. And so that's where, again, I didn't love the strategy to begin with, but I think I'm kind of, becoming converted a little
Coming
bit
around to it.
that there was some wisdom here on the part of Schumer and Jeffries, where, it's still, especially a Blue Sky. I notice this whenever I post like a Jeffries clip where he's just saying, something normal, where the replies and quote tweets are just like, get this guy off my screen or retire, but again, that's kind of where I have to humble myself a lot of the time because, people in a place like Blue Sky are very politically engaged. They have very strong opinions, but they're not really necessarily speaking to those people. They're trying to win kind of a more broad-based public argument for people who are less engaged. And so, I've been tempted a couple times to kind of, sort of put on my pundit hat and weigh in on the messaging. But then, I've been reminding myself that I don't have all the answers. I'm kind of have to assume that these guys know what they're doing. I mean, as hard as that can be when we reflect on what happened in March and how poorly that went, hopefully they learned from that. And it does seem like so far that they have.
Well, that's a great thing. You can put your pundit hat on this show every week because
Yeah, that's true.
you at least your mentions don't get crushed.
Yes.
But I want to talk about something else that you referenced about the three Democratic senators who did vote for this GOP bill, and it's worth talking about who they are because one was John Fetterman, and he almost doesn't count. He really just for quite some time now has been doing his own thing. Sometimes he's a loyal Democrat, and I guess that's not really the right way to put it. Sometimes he votes with the Democratic Party, but the rest of the time he likes to crap on the Democratic Party. He's a real weirdo. I don't see him as having a long career. I see him following a cinema type route. If he runs for re-election, I expect him to get a very serious primary challenge. And then the other two, not necessarily representative of a lot of other Democratic senators. One was Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada. And it's important to note that her home state colleague, Jackie Rosen, voted against it. And the third was Angus King, who isn't actually even a Democrat. He is. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Okay, cool. My AirPods just died. Angus King is an independent from Maine. I have to imagine he is in his last term. I mean, I hope to God he is quite up there in years. So yeah, looking at that list, if it had been another group of three, in Nevada, also, that's a state that moved sharply toward Trump last year and has some very unique political problems that aren't necessarily shared. Problems for Democrats aren't necessarily shared in other states. If it had been a different group of senators, I might be more concerned, if like John Ossoff and Alyssa Slotkin had voted for this, I'd be like, oh, yikes, this could be going south soon. But I mean, John Ossoff, the most vulnerable Democratic senator in the country who's up for reelection next year, and he's saying no. And going on the attack against Republicans. So yeah, look, things could change in a hurry, especially if the polls go south. But I saw that list of three, and I'm like, okay, that's a little bit of a bunch of weirdos there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's been some speculation that Shaheen would be kind of the next domino to fall. Although, she was actually on Fox and Friends yesterday for a pretty combative interview where she, the host Lawrence Jones was invoking the talking point we've heard over and over from Mike Johnson about, oh, Democrats want to give healthcare to illegal immigrants, and she basically said, no, that's not true. So I was impressed that she, didn't kind of buy into the framing or sort of indulge him, just sort of shut it down. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right that those three, if you had to pick a set of three in terms of trying to project from there to how things are going to play out, that's relatively reassuring that it isn't kind of vulnerable members who, might be more harbingers of other members who would vote similarly. So yeah, that is good, but so they would need a total four more, assuming Rand Paul flips, and yeah, the math doesn't seem great. I mean, I know Ossoff was on Pod Save America, I believe that was about a week ago, and seemed pretty resolute. And actually, his team was very happy with that interview. They were kind of pushing me. I posted a couple clips from it, but I think he's trying to get himself out there. Gearing up for what's going to be a very tough race next year. And he's great on shows like that. But there was no sign in any of his comments about the shutdown, which at that time was still in the future. Because government shut down this week, and this was last week where the interview occurred. But he seemed to be pretty much on board. Willing to go follow the lead from Schumer on this one. So. Yeah, I mean, we'll see when we log off here, and if anybody in the comments wants to let us know. I believe the Senate is probably voting right around now, so that is kind of an important vote to see if anybody else feels off. Because if nobody does feel off, then I think we're probably looking at this going into at least like the middle part of next week. But if more dominoes keep falling, at a certain point the math becomes kind of tenuous, and there will be pressure on members who are kind of in the middle, might be more moderate, to possibly supply that decisive vote. But I guess I don't really see that happening. It seems like the lines are pretty well drawn and people are pretty dug in. So, I think this is going to go into at least next week at this point.
So we have more than 1,100 people joining us today. Thank you so much. Again, please pop into the chat box there with your questions. We have a good comment here from Wendy, who says that I don't think Trump using this shutdown to further target funding for blue states is going to help the Republicans. And I think that is a really good point, because we saw that announcement. Aaron, remind me, was it from a Vought or via Vought about targeting a transportation funding, woke DEI, whatever funding in a whole bunch of blue states? Do I have that right?
Yeah, you're right. I'm really glad that Wendy made that point, because we really should have brought this up earlier, that when we're talking about the polling and how Republicans are kind of losing on this, I think this is part of it, that it's so nakedly partisan, where Vote, his name is a weird one. I think it's Vote is how it's pronounced. But
okay,
oftentimes with these political names, you read them all the time or type them, but never say them. But I think it's Vote. But I don't know. Someone, if someone wants to put the pronunciation, so we can read it.
Help us out.
We can just call him Russ. Why don't we just call him Russ? OMB guy Russ. But anyway, when he came out with this list, and I saw some Democratic accounts who put helpful maps where it was like, here are all the states in 2024 that went for Kamala Harris, and every single one was targeted by Russ OMB guy for cuts. But and I remarked on this yesterday on social media too, that even Thune, who's regarded as being more of like a normal Republican, has very much sounded like a mobster in the context of the shutdown thing, and it's in terms of like, if these Democrats don't want more pain upon their constituents, they better vote to keep the government open. And I don't think that helps. In terms of when these politicians start sounding like kind of mob bosses, or they're trying to extort Americans, because I think people want to, at least on some level, like your normie American wants to believe that we're kind of all in this together, that it shouldn't be kind of a zero-sum red state versus blue state scenario. And so, I do think that messaging has been pretty bad. Even Johnson today was on, I believe it was the CBS morning show, or maybe it was, no, I take it back, it was ABC Today. And, and these are not, the hosts on Today are not like political hosts. I mean, they obviously have to have enough knowledge to talk about these issues, but they're not, deep in the weeds. But even, I believe it was Craig Melvin on the Today Show pushed back on Johnson when he brought up the illegal immigrants getting Medicaid thing, and said that's not true. um, very mildly. But the point simply being that even on these forums where maybe Johnson would expect that he could get away with kind of these BS talking points, he's not really getting away with them. So you have these kind of false talking points that are debunked at every turn, and then you have kind of like threats and attempts to extort blue states, and like not a great message. And I think maybe that's showing up a little bit like that Washington Post poll. And that's kind of all they got, really. We've kind of seen the full gamut of talking points, and they're not very persuasive.
So Deborah makes a really good point, which is exactly what I wanted to talk about next, which is that Republicans make the mistake that thinking a blue state is all blue. It's not. There's a healthy dose of red. And indeed, that's right. And I was looking at that list of states before Yom Kippur that they want to target by withholding or denying these transportation funds. And yeah, they're all blue states, of course, but they have a number of Republican House seats that are potentially vulnerable next year. And it's not a ton, but the back of the back of the napkin math that I did, back of the napkin, no, back of the envelope, napkin math, whatever.
Napkin on the napkin, back in the envelope,
Yes,
something like
thank
that.
you. Anyway,
Yeah.
the brief sketch that I did, I don't know, it was around like 8 to 10 seats, and Republican seats in these states like California, New York, New Jersey, and the House is really, really close. Democrats only need to flip 4 seats. Now that number is going to get bigger, already has gotten bigger thanks to this GOP gerrymandering push, but. Yeah, if you're a Republican, in New York, New Jersey, California, a few Colorado as well, how are you going to explain this to your constituents? This
Mhm.
sucks, man, and it opens such a ready line of attack.
Right. And Mike Lawler, for instance, was on CNN a couple nights ago, asked about that. He was asked about this because one of the projects that is scuttled for now is like some sort of transportation tunnel in New York that
Oh, it's a big one.
especially affects his district. And he came across really impotent in this interview because basically his line ended up being, "This is a bummer. I'm contacting the White House to like try to get them to reconsider." And Caitlin Collins was like, "Did they get back to you?" And he was like, "No, I haven't heard anything back." So he's just being like totally ignored. So he comes across looking kind of pathetic because he's on, he's still kind of trying to toe the party line of like it's on Chuck Schumer and the Democrats to reopen the government. But then when he's asked about the harm to his district, it's like, well, I'm trying to mitigate that, but like no one's really listening to me. Who matters, And so yeah, it does kind of put people like that in a problematic box. And you're right that there's 4 Republicans in the New York delegation, and I think with the exception of like Tenney, I mean those seats are pretty hard fought seats. So any little thing can make a difference. And when your own constituents are being hurt by the party of your Republic, a Republican president hurting constituents in a Republican district, yeah, I mean that's a tough thing for a guy like Lawler to explain away.
So I want to mention something else that is going to happen next week in Congress as we watch the shutdown. And this is a little bit of a swerve here, but Aaron, you might have seen that Republicans in the House refused to swear in the newest Democratic member of Congress. That's Adelita Grijalba. She won a special election last month for the seat held by her late father. That was, of course, Raul Grijalba. And what's super important about this, not just the fact of her constituents getting representation, is that she would be the 218th and final signature necessary to force a vote on the Epstein files. And Democrats tried to force Republicans to get her to be sworn in, and whoever was at the dais just gavelled in and out in pro forma session, refused to let Grijalva be sworn in. And there have been 3 other special elections prior to this one in Arizona this year. And in all 3 cases, Aaron, the winner the winner was sworn in to Congress the following
Yeah.
day, literally one day later. But Grijalva, she's going to have to wait at least 2 weeks. And it's so naked and so obvious.
Yeah.
And there is only so long that they can push this off for. Johnson claimed that she would be sworn in when Congress returns for a regular session. Anyway, it's a load of crap. Who knows how long, much longer they might try to push it out for. But she will get sworn in. That is going to happen. Looks like it's going to be next week. And the first thing she's going to do is going to sign that discharge petition. And boom, then you have 218 signatures. Now, maybe Republicans are furiously trying to get the three Republicans who signed this, that's NTG, Boebert, and Nancy Mace, to withdraw their names. Thomas Massey's obviously not going to withdraw his name. It's his petition. Um, but yeah, I think that is going to be yet another deeply unpleasant thing that Republicans are going to have to deal with very, very soon.
No, you're right. And Johnson, when he was on CBS yesterday, I was surprised that he was asked about this, but he basically said kind of along the lines of what you were saying, that well, there's a shutdown and it was a holiday yesterday. It's going to have to be next week. And but I think what you mentioned there toward the end is absolutely correct, that there is probably wrangling behind the scenes to flip some of the Republican votes back to shutting down the discharge position. That would be, I would be shocked if that doesn't happen because, when the chips are down, I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene or Nancy Mace, who, is running for governor and, needs Trump's help to win that race. I don't think they're going to take a vote that's going to be against Trump's wishes or potentially hurting him in some way. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's kind of behind the scenes wrangling, some sort of concessions that Mike Johnson can offer. Like you said, Massey, I don't think is going to flip. But you do have these other two, Mace, who is a sycophant all the way through, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, her entire rise was as like the leader of the Trump cult, basically, roping his the cardboard cutout of him at a campaign event. I still remember that video. And so I don't believe that they are going to kind of stick to their guns on this one. I'd love to be proven wrong about that, but my guess would be that Johnson is trying to buy some time. There's probably negotiations happening behind the scenes, and when the vote comes up, I believe it's not even really a vote because you need the 218 for there to be a vote that takes place, right? Because it's basically getting it on the floor. I just don't think that the 218 is going to be there, once Gravalha, once she's actually sworn in.
Huh. Well, you know what? Look, I would say it's about 50-50. I'll take the other side of that bet with you.
Okay.
And the reason why I say that is because as we have seen really since the things really broke into the open at the start of the summer with Epstein, that there has been this real split on the right on this issue, that there are, certain MAGA types who are capable of being totally bought off and said, "Oh, there's nothing to see here. We were, Democrats are making a mountain out of a molehill," and going with the Trump talking points on this. But a lot more have been so bought in to this notion that Jeffrey Epstein was the leader of a massive conspiracy of, politician pedophiles, and they want to see what's there. And the more that Trump tries to hide it, I think the angrier and more upset that they have gotten. And for Nancy Mace, she's in an interesting position in that, yeah, you're right. She probably wants Trump's endorsement to win that primary, but it's a busy primary, and she might be thinking, maybe my real route here is to go with the hardest of the hardcore MAGA base, the part that has dissented from Trump on this, and she wants kudos from them. I mean, look, it could have happened that Grijalva was sworn in already, right? I mean, like she couldn't be certain that Grijalva would not get sworn in for another week. So, like, it could have hit 218 before they had the chance. I mean, they're playing a dangerous game by going down to the wire here. So I don't know, but
I think
you're skeptical.
I'm more cynical about MAGA, I guess, in the sense that, I think when the chips are down, these people are cult members first and foremost, and then kind of like sincerely concerned about pedophilia way down the list of concerns that they have. So, I don't really think that, I think that a lot of the Epstein stuff was viewed as a way, because they obviously Bill Clinton has been implicated, and it's kind of an offshoot of the whole like Pizzagate, the whole theory of Pizzagate, which was that Democrats are running these pedophilia rings out of Comet Ping Pong in DC, and I've just never really believed that there's a whole lot of sincerity there, or at least the sincerity only goes kind of skin deep, and then if it gets to a spot where it endangers dear leader, I think that's what's going to take. Kind of the that's what they are going to act upon as his interests, and not any kind of deeper seated concerns about the abuse of children or anything like that. Again, I would love to be proven wrong on that. And Nancy Mace, for sure, I think will flip. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think will too, honestly. I mean, and then I think they would only need one Republican right to flip, and then it would no longer be 217 instead of 218.
Correct.
So, maybe they can figure out which one needs a hall pass and then kind of go from there. But I guess we can check back next week, right? I mean, we're going to know
We
next
will.
week because apparently, we'll have the full complement of members sworn in. And if there's 218, then that should be a pretty quick process to get that, to get the discharge position to the floor. So we'll see.
Well, we are a little bit past time, in fact. Thank you, everyone, to joining us. We had 1,300 people, huge turnout today. We will be keeping an extremely close eye on everything having to do with the shutdown. We will check back in on all of that, plus the Epstein files, discharge petition as well. And who knows what the hell else will pop up next week. As always, if you have not yet subscribed to Public Notice, Aaron's publication, it's publicnotice.co or find it in the Substack app. It is a must read for the kind of coverage that is utterly lacking in the traditional media. These days, we have seen that you really just can't trust the big corporate media anymore. They are all too willing to cut deals with Trump, to cancel folks like Jimmy Kimmel, all for their bottom lines, for their corporate mergers, for their stockholders. But that's why you need to rely on independent media like Public Notice, and vice versa. If you're a Public Notice subscriber and have not yet signed up for the down ballot, it's the-downballot.com. We have incredibly thorough coverage about all of the down ticket elections that are going to be so important for fighting against autocracy and protecting democracy next year. So please sign up for both of our publications, and everyone have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you here next week.
See you next time.